Imagine standing in a crowded room where every whisper, every unspoken grievance, and every heavy heart is broadcasting a frequency that only you can hear. For millions of individuals, this isn't a metaphor. It is their daily neurological reality. They are what psychology terms highly empathetic individuals, or empaths. But what happens when that frequency turns from standard background noise into an absolute, deafening roar of deep suffering? Recent neuroscientific research into mirror neurons shows us that when an empath encounters profound grief, their brain doesn't just register that someone else is hurting. The insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, the regions responsible for processing our own physical and emotional pain, light up as if the trauma were happening directly to them. It is a state of constant, involuntary emotional plagiarism. But here is the paradox that puzzles behavioral scientists. When an empath goes through their own dark night of the soul, or experiences a catastrophic emotional overload, something fundamental breaks. But it doesn't break them down, it breaks them open. They emerge from the fire completely unrecognizable to those who knew them before. They stop absorbing the room. They stop drowning. Why? What happens inside the architecture of a highly sensitive brain when it hits rock bottom? If you have ever felt entirely consumed by the pain of this world, or if you are wondering how to navigate deep emotional sensitivity without destroying your own mental health, what we are about to unpack will fundamentally change how you view your emotional wiring. We are going to explore the exact neurological pivot point where overwhelming sensitivity transforms into unshakable, masterful strength. Empaths have highly active mirror neuron systems, meaning deep suffering is not just witnessed, it is physically and emotionally replicated in their own nervous systems. True suffering forces an empath to move past intellectual empathy into raw emotional resonance, shattering their old emotional boundaries. Prolonged suffering alters the neural pathways of the brain, forcing the empath to transition from absorbing pain to channeling it. Transformation occurs when an empath learns the crucial distinction between empathy, feeling with, and compassion, wishing well without drowning. A transformed empath no longer acts as an emotional sponge. They become an anchor, capable of holding space for intense suffering without losing their own sense of self. The human brain is a marvel of interconnected circuitry. But for a specific subset of the population, certain networks operate with a heightened, almost volatile level of fidelity. To understand why deep suffering permanently reshapes an empath, we must first examine the biological engine driving their everyday experience, the mirror neuron system. Located across key premotor and parietal regions of the cortex, mirror neurons are the neurological foundation of human connection. When you watch someone pick up a glass of water, or smile, or wince in pain, these specialized cells fire in a pattern that precisely mimics the action or emotion you are observing. In the average brain, this system acts as a gentle translator, providing a subtle intellectual cue about another person's internal state. It is the mechanism behind cognitive empathy, the clean, rational understanding that someone else is having a difficult day. For the highly empathetic individual, however, this system does not merely translate, it amplifies. Neuroimaging studies reveal that when an empath witnesses distress, their mirror neuron networks exhibit a state of hyperresonance. The boundary between the self and the other becomes neurologically porous. When they look at someone experiencing profound grief, anger, or despair, the signal bypasses the intellectual filters of the prefrontal cortex and plunges directly into the limbic system, the brain's emotional and survival command center. Specifically, the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, which map the visceral, physical sensations of pain, light up with intense activity. The empath's nervous system treats the external stimulus as an internal reality. This is not a conscious choice or a lack of psychological fortitude. It is an involuntary, biological duplication of data. They are literally plagiarizing the suffering of their environment, registering another person's trauma within their own flesh and blood. This constant influx of raw, unedited emotional data inevitably triggers what behavioral scientists call limbic overload. The amygdala, tasked with scanning the environment for threats, becomes chronically overstimulated by the recycled stress hormones of the people around them. The untransformed empath lives in a perpetual state of low-grade, systemic fight or flight, their body flooded with cortisol and adrenaline simply from walking through a crowded room or sitting across from a distressed colleague. Because the brain cannot distinguish between a threat happening directly to the individual and a threat mirrored from someone else, the physiological toll is identical to experiencing personal trauma. Over time, this chronic overactivation erodes psychological resilience, leaving the individual emotionally exhausted, physically drained, and deeply vulnerable to vicarious burnout. When this hyper-resonant system is suddenly confronted with an acute, catastrophic wave of deep suffering, whether through personal tragedy or an overwhelming exposure to collective crisis, the limbic system reaches a critical tipping point. The sheer volume of emotional data exceeds the brain's capacity to process and regulate it. The old strategy of absorbing the pain, internalizing it, and attempting to quietly carry it forward fails catastrophically. The internal emotional ecosystem becomes completely saturated, pushed to the absolute brink of psychological survival. It is precisely within this state of profound limbic overload that the brain realizes its current operating system is unsustainable. The agonizing weight of the mirrored suffering acts as a massive evolutionary pressure, forcing the neural architecture to either break down completely or undergo a radical, permanent structural adaptation to survive the sensory deluge. The collapse of cognitive empathy under the weight of deep suffering marks the definitive threshold where an empath's old psychological operating system fails forever. In ordinary social interactions, cognitive empathy functions as a clean, intellectual buffer, a mental scaffolding that allows a person to objectively perceive, label, and understand another individual's emotional state without actually absorbing the impact of it. It is the capacity to stand on the shoreline, recognize that someone else is caught in a dangerous undercurrent, and rationally assess their distress from a safe distance. For a long time, an untransformed empath relies on this intellectualized veneer, attempting to use logic, rationalization, and mental boundaries to manage the massive influx of emotional data their hyper-reactive nervous system constantly intercepts. They convince themselves that if they can just understand the root cause of the pain around them, they can remain insulated from its toxic effects. However, when an empath is dragged into the epicenter of profound, cataclysmic suffering, this intellectual defense mechanism is shattered instantly. Deep suffering possesses an immense psychological gravity that completely overwhelms the abstract, analytical processing centers of the prefrontal cortex. The sheer velocity and raw density of the trauma break through the cognitive dam like a tidal wave. In this state of total emotional collapse, the luxury of distance evaporates. The empath can no longer afford to simply understand the grief, betrayal, or devastation from an intellectual standpoint. They are violently plunged into the depths of the ocean alongside the sufferer. The clinical detached labels provided by cognitive empathy are rendered entirely useless against the visceral, suffocating reality of true despair. The brain's higher-level cognitive filters are bypassed completely, forcing a direct, unmediated confrontation with raw emotional resonance. This sudden death of the intellectual buffer changes everything about how the empath experiences reality. When cognitive empathy shatters, the old, porous boundaries that the empath used to navigate the world are exposed as a dangerous illusion. Previously, they believed they could control how much pain they let in, treating their sensitivity like a window they could choose to close. Deep suffering reveals that there is no window. The entire structure of their emotional defense has been built on sand. As the intellectualized barriers dissolve, the empath is forced to experience emotion in its purest, most terrifyingly unrefined form. This is not a gentle shift in perspective. It is a violent, psychological ego death. The illusion of separation between the self and the suffering of the world is completely annihilated. The shattering of this intellectual defense is a deeply disorienting and painful experience because it strips the empath of their primary coping mechanism. Without the ability to intellectualize or compartmentalize the pain, they are left utterly exposed, experiencing the full force of the psychological trauma directly in their body and psyche. Yet, this complete destruction of cognitive empathy is the exact, mandatory catalyst required for genuine transformation. As long as the empath could rely on the shallow protection of intellectual understanding, they could avoid the painful, necessary work of building true internal sovereignty. By completely burning away the fragile, superficial defenses of the mind, deep suffering forces the empath to confront the absolute limits of their emotional endurance. It strips away the comforting lies of intellectual detachment and leaves them naked in the fire, preparing the psychological ground for an entirely new, unshakable architecture of the soul to be built from the ashes. The transformation of an empath from an overwhelmed emotional sponge to a resilient force is not merely a philosophical or spiritual shift. It is a profound physical restructuring of the brain. When an individual with a highly sensitive nervous system undergoes prolonged, deep suffering, the brain is subjected to an unprecedented level of neurochemical stress. This sustained emotional trauma serves as a powerful catalyst for neuroplasticity, the brain's innate ability to reorganize its structure, functions, and neural connections in response to internal or external stimuli. In the initial phases of this suffering, the brain's traditional neural pathways, which favor the involuntary absorption of external emotional data, are pushed to their absolute limits. The neural loops connecting the hyperreactive amygdala to the insular cortex, which continuously mirror and internalize the pain of others, become chronically overactivated. This constant flooding of stress hormones eventually reaches a critical tipping point where the brain faces a stark evolutionary choice: adapt or collapse. Faced with this existential threat to psychological survival, the brain begins to systematically dismantle its old, maladaptive pathways and construct entirely new neural architecture. The chronic overstimulation of the limbic system forces the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, emotional regulation, and cognitive control, to step in and assume command. Through a grueling process of synaptic pruning, the brain begins to weaken the pathways that allowed for the passive, uncontrolled absorption of external emotional noise. At the same time, it strengthens the neural tracks that facilitate emotional regulation, self-awareness, and psychological boundary setting. This structural rewiring alters the way the empath processes sensory and emotional data. Instead of allowing external emotional stimuli to immediately hijack the emotional center of the brain, the newly reinforced pathways route that information through the analytical and regulatory circuits of the prefrontal cortex first. This neuroplastic shift changes the entire interior landscape of the empath. The physical gray matter density in regions associated with emotional regulation and distress tolerance increases, allowing the individual to witness and hold space for immense suffering without their own nervous system registering it as a personal, existential threat. The brain essentially learns how to build a neurological firewall. It no longer treats the grief, anger, or anxiety of the outside world as internal files that need to be opened and executed. Instead, it categorizes them as external data points to be observed and evaluated from a position of neurological stability. This rewiring process is undeniably painful, as it requires the breakdown of deeply ingrained, lifelong patterns of emotional reactivity. It is a psychological remodeling project that takes place amidst the ruins of the empath's old identity. Furthermore, this profound neural transformation alters the empath's baseline resting state. The autonomic nervous system, which was once perpetually trapped in a sympathetic state of fight or flight due to the constant mirror neuron overload, learns to cultivate a highly resilient parasympathetic response. The vagus nerve, which regulates the body's ability to calm itself down after stress, becomes stronger and more responsive. As these neural pathways mature through the crucible of suffering, the empath stops operating as an open circuit that is easily shorted out by the emotional currents of the environment. The brain adapts to the dark environment of suffering by developing a sophisticated, robust internal regulation system. This ensures that the next time the individual encounters profound pain, the brain is fully equipped to channel the energy rather than drowning in it, marking a permanent evolutionary leap in their emotional intelligence. The pivot point where an empath moves from a state of perpetual victimization by their environment to a state of absolute psychological sovereignty hinges entirely on a profound paradigm shift. The transition from raw empathy to compassionate detachment. To the uninitiated, the term detachment sounds cold, clinical, and entirely antithetical to the very nature of a sensitive person. But in the vocabulary of high emotional intelligence, compassionate detachment is not the absence of care. It is the ultimate optimization of care. Before undergoing deep suffering, an empath's relationship with the world is defined by emotional contagion, an involuntary, unchecked mirroring of another person's distress. If someone in their vicinity is drowning in anxiety or grief, the empath's default setting is to dive into the turbulent waters alongside them, believing that the only way to validate or alleviate that suffering is to drown in it, too. This is a profound misunderstanding of empathy, confusing self-sacrifice with true emotional support. Deep suffering acts as a brutal but necessary educator, dismantling this unsustainable behavioral pattern. When the empath reaches their absolute breaking point, completely suffocated by the accumulated weight of a world they cannot fix, they are forced to confront a stark, biological reality. Emotional contagion is a zero-sum game that helps absolutely no one. They realize that two people drowning together does not result in a rescue. It simply results in two casualties. Out of the ashes of this collapse, the empath discovers the crucial psychological distinction between feeling with someone and feeling for someone. Empathy says, "I am taking your pain into my body and making it mine." Compassion says, "I see your pain. I care deeply about your suffering. But I recognize that this pain belongs to your journey, not mine. This realization marks the birth of compassionate detachment, a state of being where the heart remains completely open, yet the emotional borders remain fiercely protected. Neurologically and behaviorally, this shift changes how the empath shows up in moments of crisis. By establishing a firm psychological boundary, the individual stops allowing external emotional frequencies to hijack their autonomic nervous system. They learn to anchor themselves in their own emotional baseline, utilizing the prefrontal cortex to observe the surrounding chaos without absorbing its toxicity. When someone unloads immense grief or anger onto them, the transformed empath no longer acts as an emotional lightning rod, drawing the destructive current down into their own flesh. Instead, they become like a mirror or a clear pane of glass. They allow the emotion to pass through or reflect away, maintaining a steady, calm, and grounded inner landscape. This detachment is actually what enables a deeper, more sustainable form of love and service, because it frees the empath from the constant, exhausting cycle of emotional burnout. By mastering compassionate detachment, the empath ceases to be a volatile, reactive instrument of their environment. They no longer need to withdraw from the world or isolate themselves in monastic solitude to preserve their peace of mind. They can walk directly into the center of a crisis, into hospital rooms, into broken families, or into chaotic workplaces, because they know their internal firewall is unshakable. They hold a space of immense warmth and validation for the sufferer, offering an oasis of absolute presence. But they do so from a position of profound psychological safety. They understand that their value lies not in their ability to absorb the fire, but in their ability to remain cool, steady, and clear-headed while the fire burns around them, transforming their sensitivity into an enduring sanctuary for others. The culmination of this grueling evolutionary journey is the birth of the emotional alchemist, the definitive transformation of the empath from a fragile, reactive instrument into an unshakable psychological anchor. In classical alchemy, the goal was never to discard the base, heavy metals, but rather to subject them to intense heat and pressure until they transmuted into something precious and enduring. Similarly, the transformed empath does not achieve sovereignty by numbing their sensitivity or erasing their deep-feeling nature. Instead, having survived the absolute crucible of deep suffering, they learn how to take the raw, chaotic energy of human pain, both their own and that of the world, and transmute it into a steady, healing presence. They cease to operate as an emotional sponge, a passive object at the mercy of whatever atmospheric grief or anxiety happens to drift into their space. They become the active, defining force in the room, capable of holding immense space for suffering without losing an inch of their own identity. This alchemical mastery alters the very physics of how the empath interacts with human systems. In behavioral psychology, we observe that human groups naturally gravitate toward and synchronize with the most stable emotional frequency in an environment, a phenomenon known as behavioral mirroring or limbic resonance. The untransformed empath was always the one doing the synchronizing, constantly forced to match the chaotic, anxious, or heavy vibrations of their surroundings. But the alchemist, having rewired their entire neural architecture through suffering, flips this dynamic entirely. When they step into a space filled with crisis, terror, or grief, they do not absorb the panic. Instead, their internal grounding is so profound and their psychological boundaries so absolute that their nervous system acts as a massive stabilizing force. They emit a steady frequency of calm, clarity, and unconditional presence that acts as an emotional anchor for everyone else. The room begins to match them. To sit with a transformed empath is to experience a rare form of psychological safety. Because they have looked into the deepest abysses of their own suffering and survived, they are entirely unafraid of the darkness in others. They do not look away from raw grief. They do not offer shallow, toxic positivity or intellectualized platitudes to rush the sufferer through their pain. They have the rare, formidable capacity to just sit in the fire with another human being, offering an unblinking, compassionate witness. They understand that true healing does not require fixing the person or absorbing their burden. It requires providing a container strong enough to hold the weight of that suffering until the person can find their own footing. The empath becomes that container, a sanctuary that is completely porous to love and connection, but entirely impervious to emotional destruction. Ultimately, the birth of the alchemist represents the ultimate optimization of emotional intelligence. It is the realization that sensitivity, when married to absolute internal boundaries and radical self-sovereignty, is not a vulnerability at all. It is the highest form of human power. The transformed empath walks through the world with an open heart and an iron spine. They have traded the exhausting, codependent drive to save everyone for the masterfully detached capacity to empower everyone. They understand that their value to a hurting world does not lie in how beautifully they can suffer alongside it, but in how flawlessly they can maintain their light, their peace, and their clarity in the absolute midst of the dark.